Bad Paper is the name of the book, Chasing Debt from Wall Street to the Underworld. It's a new book coming out in fall of 2014. Jake Halpern is the author. Mr. Halpern, what is Bad Paper?
Well, Bad Paper is about this world that exists just beneath the surface that we don't know about. So when we have credit card debt, or you don't pay your gym bill, your book club membership, for a certain period of time, the creditors sell this debt off for pennies on the dollar, and it kind of drops off the above ground economy, and then it's bought, sold, sometimes even stolen in this kind of financial underworld that exists. And when this paper, and this particular story is about a parcel of this debt, which they call paper, gets stolen, it becomes bad paper. And my book is about a banker, a former banker, and a former armed robber who go into business together and buy $1.5 billion worth of this credit card debt for pennies on the dollar. And it's about their friendship, their partnership, and their misadventures as a chunk of this debt gets stolen, and the former armed robber then must delve into this underworld and track down who has possession of this debt and try to put a stop to it. And so it sounds so crazy, but it really is actually the logical thing that happens in the absence of regulation, which is that this banker learns quickly, I can't call the Attorney General, I can't rely on the feds to bail me out, I need a kind of strong man to kind of protect my investment. And this is how he teams up with the former armed robber.
Walk us through a bad debt. Somebody doesn't pay their credit card, $1,500, whatever.
Right.
Can't pay it. That money's sitting there. What happens to it? Where does it go?
Well, that's a great question. So, and of course, it's a very common thing in the Great Recession, the down economy. So you're a regular guy, you're working, you lose your job, you've always made your credit card payments on time, you've been a responsible citizen. All of a sudden you have to make these hard choices. Do I pay my utility bills? Do I buy books for kids to go to school? Do I pay the credit card? And you don't pay the credit card for 6 months, which happens to a lot of folks. At that point, the bank charges it off. And what they do is they sell it for pennies on the dollar to debt buyers. And all they do is they create an Excel spreadsheet. So it's like your name, your social security number, your address, date you opened, date you closed the account, and then they sell that for 1/100th of its value to some guy in Ohio who now, if he can just collect a small fraction of that value, whatever he can collect, he keeps. And these files, your debt is just being basically bought, sold, emailed on thumb drives, and the more times it's bought and sold, interest is accruing along the way. Often these debts are inflated, and sometimes they're kind of what they call double and triple sold. So 3 people think they owe your debt, and they're all calling you, and you pay one, and then another person keeps calling you, and that's where it becomes bad paper, where there's no sense and confidence in who really owns this. The person on the other line, they don't even know, they assume that it's the original creditor. They don't know that it's some guy in Buffalo who bought it on a street corner in a thumb drive. So that's the kind of hidden aspect of this world. We assume when they call you and say, hey, I'm calling about this MasterCard account, and you opened it, you think it's the bank, and it's really just a kind of entrepreneur who's bought it and is hoping to turn a tidy profit by collecting 1/10 of its value.
What rights do the people on the other end of the line have?
So it's a great question, and everything hinges on this, do you own this debt or not? And here's a really interesting aspect of this. So these spreadsheets are bought and sold, right? The bank sells them off, the creditors sell them off. They're not really concerned with what happens after that. Down the road at some point, often these debts are sued on, right? And so what happens is someone gets a summons and says, you come to court on this date, or you have to we're going to have a judgment against you. There's a 90% no-show rate in America. 90% of the people that are sued don't show up. Sometimes it's because they weren't served with the papers properly. Sometimes it's because they don't understand what's happened. So it comes before the judge, and when the other person doesn't show, the judge just says, okay, $7,462, even if the original debt was $2,000, boom. There's a judgment, then for the next 10 to 20 years, they can garnish your wages. If you show up in court, this is the crazy thing that I saw when I followed this piece of debt that got stolen through the system. If you show up in court and simply say to the opposing counsel, can you show me the evidence that you do in fact own this debt? Your question, where is the proof of ownership? The case disappears because there is no proof most of the time. The banks aren't selling the evidence when they're selling off these spreadsheets, because that would involve a significant amount of work of delving back into records. It would no longer be affordable to sell for pennies on the dollar. So there's often no proof of ownership, and there's no kind of accurate accounting of the amount of this debt or who owns it. And again, the proof is when you go to court and you say these magic words. And I talked to a guy who did this multiple times, simply said, "Where's the proof?" Boom, it kind of evaporated. So the whole system is in many ways dysfunctional from start to finish.
Where does the underworld part
Okay, so when Bank of America sells off a debt, go back to your example of what happens. Joe Blow loses his job, $1,500 worth of debt. Bank of America is not going to sell it to, a criminal on the streets. They'll sell it to a debt buyer in Ohio who seems like a reputable company that has a call center. But when that debt buyer in Ohio can't sell it, they'll sell it to someone further down the food chain. And the further you get down the food chain of the debt, inevitably what happens is the collectors become more aggressive in how they collect, because they have to. If you haven't paid the kind of white glove customer service guy at Bank of America or the nicer people in Ohio, it's time to get tough. And what happens is towards the bottom of the food chain, as the paper becomes, or the debt becomes cheaper and grimier, as they call it, it often drops into the hands of folks who are less scrupulous. And that's where it often gets double sold and triple sold. And you have these people that know they've been sold this debt in an improper way, that three other people have it and they're racing to collect on it. And that's really where this kind of underworld exists. And what you have, and what I saw in Buffalo, where I went back there, is guys buying and selling this consumer debt on street corners in thumb drives. Guys who formerly sold drugs and said, you know what, it's not worth it to sell crack anymore. It's more worth our while to sell debt because the penalties are less. And in weird ways, one of the guys I profile in the book says, we call debt the white man's dope, because the whole way that it's packaged, he said, with drugs, it's the cartels, and it kind of works its way down and kind of gets smaller amounts, and you never know who the supplier above you is. And he felt that it was weirdly analogous to the way that the debt was being bought, where you only know the supplier above you and you're not sure of the quality of what you're selling is. And so this is what exists in this kind of, in some poor communities, and often people who can't get jobs elsewhere, can't start businesses elsewhere, are jumping into this. And some of the people there are doing their best to kind of do it above board, but there's also a lot of shady stuff. And the victims, of course, are often American consumers.
You write in your book, Bad Paper, that there are more debt collectors in Buffalo than there are Masons, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so Buffalo is a place where, of course, there used to be a lot of industrial jobs, and in the absence of that, with the steel mills closing, a lot of service sector jobs and a lot of debt collecting jobs. And I asked one guy that I met in Buffalo, I said, why is this thriving in Buffalo so much? And he said, well, we've kind of been in a recession since the 70s. So when we're talking to folks on the phone in 2012 and they're commiserating about their financial conditions, we've been there all along, and we have some sort of empathy, because when the collector calls you, part of this, what they call is the talk off, the idea is to marry the debtor. So again, if you're Joe Blow and you owe $1,500 and you're out of work, and I'm, say, in Buffalo and I'm working this job, I can say, hey brother, I feel your pain. I live in a place where a lot of people are out of work, we're just getting by. And that empathy then becomes the basis for me to convince you to pay $10 on your credit card instead of whatever else you may have. So, not all collections is bad paper. Not all collections are people doing kind of shady means. There's a lot of people in Buffalo who are trying to do it kind of above board, but it's a difficult way to make a living.
Are the credit rating agencies involved in this at all? Do they ever get the information?
So the credit rating agencies basically typically rely on actually often it's incumbent on the consumer. So when you pay that debt off, and you've paid someplace in Buffalo that you say, can you give me some proof? It's then your job, if you can believe this, to get a copy of that letter and send it to the 3 credit bureaus and hope that they then put that on your report and that reflects your efforts to pay it off. But there's no kind of like integrated system where you pay it off and boom, it applies on your credit report and you're all clear to go and it shows that you're upstanding. The system deeply fragmented, and it's part of why it needs to be changed.
Is it different state to state?
Yeah, it is.
The rights of the consumer.
Yeah, it is. A lot of this comes because a lot of the enforcement comes down to the state level. So New York actually has a pretty aggressive state attorney general's office that goes after some of these collectors. And what they told me actually was that some of the folks that were up to kind of bad tricks in Buffalo were moving to Georgia because the word was that they were more lax in Georgia. And well, if we have to close up shop here, we'll move down there and we can have far more latitude. We do have, now this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that's supposed to be protecting us, and they are doing some stuff, but they're going after the big national operators, and a lot of the worst behavior is going on this local state level. And if you go to Georgia, and there's no one there in the AG's office that's going to after you, you're going to be able to operate with a great amount of impunity.
Jake Halpern, how many Americans are caught in this trap right now?
There are something along the lines of 30 million Americans who are, have substantial amounts of credit card debt. I think an average of $1,500 per debt. So I think many more people are ensnared in it than they realize, and they have no idea exactly where their debt has been. I mean, in this particular story in my book, I talk to these consumers, and their debt. There's two women whose stories I follow, and they pay someone that calls them that has all the information that would give me or you confidence. Your social security number, your address, you open the account. Okay, we'll pay this. Well, it didn't appear on the credit report, like you're saying. They start making calls. Who did I pay? Well, they paid the guy that stole this debt. And what happens, and this goes back to my book, as the banker that bought this debt for pennies on the dollar, he starts getting calls from his collectors saying, hey, these debtors that we're talking to are saying they paid someone else. Somehow this debt has been stolen. At which point the banker, who's one of the main characters in my book, calls his associate, the former armed robber, and says, you got to put a stop to this. So he does his detective work, gets a bunch of ex-cons with guns, drives in a car down to Buffalo, and confronts the guy that has his debt improperly in his liquor store. There's a showdown. And this is the state. And I was telling this to these consumers, do you realize that this is who you paid, and this is where? And they were of course totally surprised, because no one would imagine that these kind of crazy shenanigans are existing in what is ostensibly a bank debt, which you would think is fairly above board business.
Where did the idea for this book come from?
Okay, so this is a funny story. I had written an article for the New Yorker about a debt collector from Buffalo, and it was a story actually about a young African-American guy, been to prison, gets out, only job he can get is a debt collector, single dad, raising his kids, and he's really trying to do it right. He's trying to follow the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. He's a pretty upstanding guy. And I just write about his life and anyway, the story comes out in the New Yorker, and we get a call from Brad Pitt's production company from HBO, and they said, we want to turn this into an HBO series. And they said, would you take the screenwriter back to Buffalo and show him around? I said, does the screenwriter stay in my parents' house? Yeah. So me and the screenwriter we're in my parents' house. He's in the attic. My dad is like making him dinner. The whole thing was very funny. And I called all of the people from the New Yorker story and saying, hey, I've got this guy. He's working for Brad Pitt, will you? And of course, when I'm the journalist, no one wants to talk to me. Brad Pitt, I got this long list. So I'm the handler taking this, the babysitter basically taking the screenwriter around from meeting to meeting. And one of these meetings is this former banker and this former armed robber who go into business together, and they have this kind of amazing chemistry, and they're kind of friends, and they don't trust each other, and they like it, And I'm listening to them banter, and the screenwriter's taking notes, and the screenwriter was in the next thing, and I say, guys, this story, it needs no fictionalization. This is pure nonfiction red meat. Would you consider, letting me tell your story? The banker says yes. The former armed robber says, you want to tell my story? You come up to my house. He's a, South Boston guy. You come up to Bangor to my house, and we'll talk. And so I drove up to Bangor, and we had a face-to-face, and, kind of felt me out. We shook hands. We'd do this, and then I was just off and rolling with these two guys for the last year or so. And that was the genesis of this story was, basically me taking the screenwriter around.
Well, your book is coming out in the fall of 2014. Is there going to be an HBO series?
I don't know. This is, I've had a few things optioned, and it always I think they say you need 10 miracles in order for it to happen, and I think we're still probably about 8 miracles shy of the red carpet.
And a very quick preview of Jake Halpern's newest book, Bad Paper: Chasing Debt from Wall Street to the Underworld. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, television for serious readers.